Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on opportunities for business environment reform through the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. We have an exciting webinar ahead of us with speakers from the WTO, from OECD, from the World Bank, GIZ, as well as from the international legal community. This webinar will touch upon business environment reforms that can be stimulated, motivated in the context of the recently concluded negotiations on the text of the international agreement, which the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement would be the first international investment agreement once signed that has been agreed upon. So it's a quite groundbreaking development, and particularly when we think about the current international context, which is really driven by a lot of increasing volatility, tensions, geopolitical tensions, and a stagnating capital flow to developing countries, this agreement couldn't have come at a more opportune time. In the context of these difficulties, the investment gap for developing countries to reach the Sustainable Development Goals has been increasing. So according to the latest estimates from the United Nations, the investment gap is now over close to $4 trillion US dollars compared to 2.5 in 2014. So it's really a very, very positive development. I would like to introduce you to the speakers and a little bit give you an overview of the flow before we launch straight into the more exciting part, which is the content of the webinar. So we'll start off. We'll hear from Claudia Locatelli, who is actually leading the joint initiative negotiations on investment, the international agreement for investment facilitation at the WTO Secretariat. She will give us a brief introduction to the agreement as well as the latest on where we are in the process. So we'll hear straight from the Secretariat, followed by a presentation by Mark Reichel, who is a lawyer with over 20 years experience in international law and economics, and who specializes on advising governments on improving the investment climate. Followed by Ivan Nimak from the World Bank Group, who will provide the global perspective from the developing countries. Ivan is the global lead for investment policy and promotion at the World Bank Group, where he oversees a portfolio of over 60 country projects and programs focusing on investment policy and retention. Then we'll hear from Christian Pitchas, who has also over 20 years, we have a very experienced panel here, over 20 years experience in international trade law. He is now advisor on international trade and investment policy with the German development organization GIZ. And he will speak to us a little bit more about the modalities of implementing the agreement, particularly for developing and least developed countries. And last but not least, we have Anna Nowik from the OECD. She's the head of the investment division of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs at the OECD, where she focuses on sustainable investment, climate, and she will focus her intervention on sustainable investment. So this, as you can see, we'll have a lot of interesting perspectives on the agreement, its content, and its relevant in the current context, particularly for developing countries. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to pose any questions throughout the presentations. We'll go through the presentations and the interventions, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But don't hesitate to already enter any comments in writing as they occur to you throughout in the Q&A. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Claudia to the floor and kick off this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and thank you for inviting me. And it's an extremely timely seminar because actually at the moment, the IFD participants are meeting to discuss next steps and in particular the upcoming General Council. So it couldn't be more timely. So, well, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. And Let me say a few words on the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. There, actually, in the pictures, you see the two co-coordinators on down left. It's the ambassador of Korea and the ambassador of Chile, but we can go to the next slide immediately. So this whole initiative, which is called a joint initiative, because it's in a sense it's a new development in the WTO. It's not a multilaterally mandated negotiation, but investment facilitation for development was launched by a group of developing and emerging countries. So it was really led by developing countries, and the focus is very much on development, pro-development. So, so this negotiation has been, well, basically started not as a negotiation, started as an informal dialogue back in 2017, with a lot of groundwork on what is investment facilitation, what should such an agreement contain, because there was really at the time there was no model, there was no template. They really the WTO members who participated in this initiative, who grew and grew over time, this group, there are now something like 116 members, mostly developing members. So they really started from scratch and took inspiration from trade agreements. They had regional trade agreements, investment agreements, existing WTO agreements, also including services, domestic regulations. So they really put this together and worked on the different provisions basically from 2017 onwards. The actual negotiations started in 2020. So, so they actually, by WTO time measurement, they really advanced very fast. So let me just say a few words on the key content of the Investment Facilitation for Development, or IFD agreement. And notably, its very first article that describes its objectives says, basically states the purpose of this agreement is to improve the transparency of investment measures, is also to streamline, speed up administrative procedures, so investment authorization procedures mainly, adopt other investment facilitation measures, and promote international cooperation between home and host countries as a means of facilitating the flow of foreign direct investment between the parties, particularly to developing and least developed country parties. So this very strong pro-development, pro-developing countries, the possibility to attract investment is clearly anchored in the objectives, with the aim of fostering sustainable development. So the ultimate objective really is to foster sustainable development, help developing members attract not only more, but also better investment. So the focus of the entire agreement is very much on ground level obstacles that investors face when they're investing abroad. Such as, for instance, the lack of easily accessible information on investment laws, on all the procedures to invest. So laws, regulations, procedures, it's defined very, very widely. And also sometimes lack of accessible information on the very practical steps, to receive a license or a construction permit, or to access essential infrastructure, etc. The lack of predictability of the regulatory environment, and also often opaque or overly complex, sometimes arbitrary investment authorization procedures. What the agreement is not about, and this is also very clearly stated in its scope article, is it does not include, it actually explicitly excludes market access, investment protection, and investor-state dispute settlement. And the agreement covers both pre and post-establishment, as is made clear in the definitions of investment activities. Investment activities cover both the pre-establishment and the post-establishment phase, and also all sectors, which is in a sense new for the WTO in a way, because the WTO, you have the agreements on market access for goods, then you have the agreements on services, but this future investment facilitation for development agreement would really cover all sectors. So from mining to I don't know, health services to all sectors. So the next slide, please. Now, just I've put here a couple of key provisions just to give you a little bit a sense of the type of provisions and commitments that are included in the agreement. So the main two sections are about transparency on the one hand side and about principles, good practice principles for authorization procedures on the other. So, but there's also many other things like responsible business conduct and anti-corruption, which I think Anna will mention in her presentation. So on transparency, for instance, there is an obligation that parties shall make available via electronic means. So ideally, even though it's not an obligation, but ideally a single information portal, updated information of importance to investors, such as all investment laws, investment regulations, information, for instance, on which sectors are open or restricted or prohibited, and on information on practical steps to invest. So, for instance, requirements, the procedures relating to establish a company, to register your business, for capital transfers, etc. The same applies, so this obligation to make available updated information for procedures, requirements to obtain, maintain, or renew investment authorizations. So investment authorization is defined extremely broadly. So it's licensing, but it can also be other authorizations, for instance, for construction permits, etc. Then I was mentioning already the single information portal. Now, the last bullet point here is an example of good practice principles for investment authorization procedures. So that goes beyond transparency. It's really obligations on how to process authorization procedures by the public sector, all levels of government, by the way. So, for instance, there are principles enshrined in the agreement like that competent authorities should accept authenticated copies in place of original documents, that they should ascertain when an application is complete, that they should inform the applicant, so the investor, of the decision that the authority has taken, and also, in case of rejection, inform of the reasons for rejection and allow to reapply. And also, although this is not a shall obligation, but an encouragement to use a single entry point to the extent practicable. Next slide, please. So I will not go into all the details, but basically the key pillars of the IFD agreement are Section 2, which is about improving the transparency and predictability of investment measures. Then Section 3, which is about streamlining, speeding up, making investment authorization procedures more more straightforward, less prone to abuse. So good practices on that. Then Section 4 is about strengthening stakeholder consultations and cross-border cooperation between home and host countries. It's also about domestic regulatory coherence. And importantly, Section 6 is on sustainable investment. So there's an article on responsible business conduct and also on anti-corruption. So as you see, it's a whole of government approach. There is in the agreement the shall language, so obligations, but there's also a lot of flexibility language. So it's a mix of the two, and it's based on it's MFN based. So there's the most favored nation principle applies, namely that there should be no discrimination amongst the parties and even actually amongst WTO members. Now, very important is, and that's the basis of the entire agreement. That's why it's in the lower part of that slide, are the special rules for developing countries and least developed countries. Again, I explained that this initiative was very much led by developing countries, and so the agreement foresees that developing and least developed countries can self-designate their implementation pace. So they can for each commitment, for each provision actually, or even sub-provision, they can designate whether this would be a category A provision, which they would implement at the entry into force of the agreement, a category B commitment for which they need more time to implement. So there would be basically a transition phase for implementation, or even a category C commitment, namely that they would implement after a certain time and after having received technical assistance and capacity building support. So so they can self-designate the pace, the entire pace of the implementation. And there's a guarantee, there's an insurance basically in the agreement that they would receive the technical assistance and capacity building support they need for implementation. So I understand that Christian Pitchness will give you more information on this really key design of the agreement, which for those of you who know WTO agreements, echoes very much, is based on the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO, which really started this new way of implementing an agreement so that developing countries, that it can be ascertained that developing countries receive the necessary support to implement the agreement and then also to benefit from its advantages. So next slide. This is simply a slide which shows you the participants in these joint statements, so-called joint statement negotiations, so plurilateral negotiations. And as of today, it's around 116 members, WTO members who participate, with a great majority of them are developing countries, and amongst those 102 developing countries, 22 are even LDCs. They're marked in green. So you can see from this slide that this is very much a developing country-led initiative. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. Now, just in a nutshell, what participants consider the main benefits of this future agreement is that it would establish global benchmark of good practices. So in order to reduce the regulatory uncertainty, policy uncertainty, and this would very much contribute to reduce transaction costs, notably for small and medium-sized enterprises, so for small investors, so to make it easier for investors to invest. By the way, those facilitation measures and those good practices would benefit not only foreign investors, even though those are the subjects typically of a WTO agreement, but it would also favor and facilitate domestic investors very much. The second benefit is that such an agreement, an international agreement with commitments taken, would very much help to anchor domestic investment facilitation reforms of many countries, and notably developing countries. So by embedding them in shared international commitments, and for instance, receiving also technical assistance to then implement them, this would very much, it is hoped, strengthen members' reform efforts. And also it would act as a positive signal to investors in the sense that it would basically be, well, a sign that if a country has, if a member has basically takes part in this agreement and ratifies this agreement eventually, that it is willing to, help facilitate investment. Then thirdly, it's the agreement and the future committee on investment facilitation for development would provide a global forum for exchanges between WTO members to facilitate investment, to enhance their cooperation internationally, but also bilaterally, plurilaterally, or regionally, and improve definitely the transparency and information exchange between them, exchange good practice, etc. So, and what I already said just before is that the agreement would link the reforms and the commitments on reforms to the ability for members to implement them by making sure developing countries obtain the technical assistance and capacity building support they need to implement and benefit from the agreement. So now the last slide, very briefly, in a nutshell, the state of play and next steps. So the latest state of play in July of this year, the IFD participants concluded the negotiations on all the substantive provisions of the agreement. So the different sections I was mentioning, the transparency one, the streamlining of authorization procedures, responsible business conduct, etc. I mean, technical assistance. What was missing still were the final provisions because they needed to make a decision amongst participants in these negotiations in what format they would seek to pursue the incorporation of the future agreement into the WTO rulebook. And that decision on which format they would pursue for incorporation of the IFD agreement into the WTO agreement was taken in October of this year, and they decided to go as a plurilateral agreement. Why? Because there is a number of members in the WTO that, not many, but there are some members who oppose those joint statement initiative format, which do not need, you know, a multilateral approval at the beginning, at least to start. And so it was IFD participants basically thought that a plurilateral agreement by which would be open-ended, so for all WTO members who wish to participate, of course, are more than encouraged by them to participate, but it would not be obligatory on all WTO members as multilateral agreements in the WTO are. The multilateral agreement is binding on all WTO members, whereas a plurilateral, open-ended plurilateral would be binding only on those members who take the decision to ratify it, to adopt it, and then to accept it. So this being said, multilateral consensus by all WTO members will be needed to incorporate the agreement into the WTO. Then in November, actually now, in mid-November, so just very recently, about 10 days ago, the members, the IFD participants, finalized the English version of the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement text, so including all the final provisions for a plurilateral agreement. The legal review has been conducted. That was a very long and painful exercise, but it was finalized. So basically, we circulated a few days ago amongst amongst all WTO members, the finalized version of the text. Maybe a word on that. The text is not is restricted, so it's not yet publicly available. But the objective of the IFD participants is to adopt and thereby freeze the text of the IFD agreement at a high-level side meeting during the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference, the WTO, what we call MC13, Ministerial Conference 13, which will take place late February in Abu Dhabi. So the IFD participants plan to basically freeze the text at a high-level side event during this ministerial conference. What is going ahead now is really they step up their outreach efforts and their positive engagement with all WTO members with a view to achieving the consensus decision that is needed to legally incorporate the agreement into the WTO rulebook. And a lot of efforts are placed also on investment facilitation needs assessment, so to help members to self-assess which commitments of the agreement they are already implementing, which ones they're not yet implementing, and what it would be needed in order to implement each provision. So there, a lot of technical assistance is really, frankly speaking, needed to help that process intensify. And the shared objective, let me conclude with that, the shared objective of the IFD participants after having adopted the text at the side meeting at MC13 will be to request the addition of the IFD agreement under Annex 4, so plurilateral agreements of the WTO agreement, as soon as possible. So I think, yes, you can just, the last slide is just an indication where you can find information on the WTO webpage. So thanks a lot, and I'm happy to reply to any questions thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's indeed even more timely than I thought, and very exciting to see the developments after 5 years of negotiations. Also, congratulations, because it was, and it's very encouraging to see that this is really also driven by the developing countries and among the members of the WTO. I would now
Thanks.
like to pass the word to Mark to lift a little bit the chapeau, so to speak, on some of the principles that are in this agreement, and what does that concretely mean to first do a needs assessment in terms of what will be assessed, and also what kind of reforms are potentially relevant for developing countries that are looking to meet the benchmark, as Claudia said it, of the principles in the agreement. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sylvia and Claudia. Yes, I would like to speak about the investment facilitation measures and the donor support that can help developing and least developed countries to implement those measures. First, let me recap a bit the important features of the agreement. Next slide, please. So on the left side, I think Claudia mentioned already the key features. It's on foreign direct investments. It excludes some facilitation measures, and there's a special support for developing and least developed countries. From a practitioner, I would like to highlight that it's the advantages I see when we go to countries is that we have a set global benchmarks of good practice. I think this is very useful to go to the countries and they see what is a good international practice in the various areas. And when countries sign, I think it's also very important when we speak to investors, they signal commitment to facilitate FDI. And the other advantage I also see that it's the investment measures, they kind of a checklist for countries, and they can identify priorities and they can identify the needs to meet these benchmarks. I think that's also a big advantage of this agreement. The other things, advantages, Claudia also mentioned already. So what I did, I prepared a paper or note with an overview of the facilitation measures and reforms that could help developing and least developed countries to meet these measures. Then there are examples of donor support, which could illustrate how a project could look like to meet these investment facilitation measures. If we please to the next slide. Just to mention that the paper has about 40 plus examples of donor support in each of these policy areas. So as Claudia mentioned, for policy areas, these policy areas, there are about 30 investment facilitation measures grouped into these 4 policy areas. And there's, of course, a very important chapter on support and special rules for developing countries and LDCs, and Christian will speak about it in more detail. What I find is also important to mention is that many of the measures give some flexibility to the signatory. And you can see this in the formulations. There are binding obligations, but there are also commitments that give some space for when they sign and to meet them and implement them. So they are formulated like the signatory or the member is encouraged to meet or implement this measure or shall endeavor or to the extent practicable, extent possible. So I think this is very good that it's not strict binding obligations, but give some leeway and time for implementing those. The 4 policy measures, policy areas, as Claudia mentioned already: transparency, streamlining of authorization procedures, focal points. The third is a bit of a mix: regulatory coherence and coordination. And the last one is sustainable investment standards. So let me go through each of those policy areas and give some examples of donor support. and reforms. Next slide, please. So the first one is transparency. Obviously, investors seek certainty, and transparency is linked to regulatory risk. The more transparent it is, the lower is the regulatory risk, and lower regulatory risk is associated to higher IFDA flows. The measures under transparency are fairly obvious. This is kind of giving information about not only the laws and the regulations, but also the procedures, step-by-step procedures, the FDI restrictions. And this information should be given free of charge and via electronic means. There's also a measure that it's given in a single information portal. So the investor doesn't have to go to many authorities if he wants to have an authorization. And there's the opportunity to comment on reformed legal changes. Two examples I would like to give. One is the online investment guides called iGuides, which have all this information. And they have information on the procedures, on the legislation, on the investment climate of a country. There are currently about 35 iGuides. They are online, and the technical assistance was to prepare these guides, to give the content, update those, and put them online. So that's one possibility to give transparency on the regulatory framework in countries. Another example is the Ghana Business Regulation Reforms portal, which is not only giving the information on investment climate regulation, on laws, on regulations. It's also going down to administrative directives or regulatory notices. So it's not only laws, it's categorized and it's searchable online, which is very useful for investors. And the added value, or the thing it also has, is it's interactive, and ministries can put out their reform projects or draft legislation and give investors or the public can give comments on this website online. So it covers a couple of these measures in the transparency policy area. Technical assistance is the IT design of this portal and filling up with content, and the whole project. I think the project ends like 2025. It's a 5-year project. So this is a very effective way of giving transparency and covering also the possibility for consultations. To the next policy area, please. The next one is administrative barriers, administrative procedures, authorization procedures. Administrative burden is, of course, connected to costs for investors. And the measures are concerning basically the effectiveness and efficiency of authorization procedures to lower the administrative burden. There are principles of good administration or good administrative procedures, but also, as Claudia already mentioned, there are very specific procedural measures. And they go from authorities should accept authenticated copies, they should give information during the application process, they should utilize single entry points, use also ICT, and give the right to review and appeal. Two examples here for donor support of reforms is one is in Serbia, where they moved the business registration away from the courts to a separate agency, which also relieved the courts, of course, from their workload. And the interesting part is it's an online registration portal. The interesting part is that it covered more and more registration procedures over time. It started with a business registration, but now you can register your tax, you do the tax registration, get your tax number, the TIN. You can register health insurance, you can social security as an employer. So finally, it's a registry for 20 registration procedures. So you can start with one registration online and you can piggyback other registrations over time. Smaller effort maybe is the online platform in Antigua and Barbuda, where you can do the construction permit. You can get the construction permit online. You apply there, you submit your documents online. You can schedule inspections, building inspections there, and you can receive the final permit. As far I checked it, as far as I see, you cannot yet do the payment online. But TA, technical assistant, concerned the ICT solution to set up the platform and to put in the content in the platform. So these are two examples for administrative procedures or measures in the authorization procedures. The next policy area is a bit of a mix. It's the institutional part, it's the focal points to receive services and information as an investor. Usually it's the investment promotion agency. Then there is regulatory coherence, which means basically that the regulation is not contradictory, that it's kind of a coherent regulatory framework for investors, and there's also cross-border cooperation measures. The two examples I have here is the establishment of the Tunisian industry portal. I should mention there's also one of the measures is to establish an updated domestic supplier database to promote linkages to the domestic businesses. So the Tunisian industry portal is basically an information portal. You get information on the regulatory procedures, on the incentives available, on the services available. It's in 4 languages. And the core part of it is a domestic supplier database, which is parted into 2 parts. One is for the manufacturer and one is for services. And it's searchable, and there's a lot of detailed information on the products they do, on the activities, on the destination, and so on. So it's a very useful, searchable database for investors if they look for a domestic partner. The other example I have here is for regulatory impact assessment, which fosters the domestic regulatory coherence. So there's a rollout. There was a test for 7 pilot RIAs for 7 ministries, and then they rolled it out to 23 ministries. It's a legal base for a RIA, and it's a procedure, it's a review process and the consultation process, which was part of the donor support for this reform. And these are 2 examples for the policy area of focal points and regulatory coherence. And the last one would be sustainable investment. Of course, it aims to promote positive contributions of enterprises of FDI to the economic and environmental and social progress. And Anna will speak about it much more in detail. So the measures are the adoption of voluntary standards for responsible business conduct. One of the measures is also the dialogue with indigenous peoples and traditional local communities and anti-corruption measures. 2 examples. One is support to the Indonesian National Corruption and Eradication Commission, which was also fighting illegal logging. So the technical assistance was to help particularly subnational units of this commission in weak areas to set up monitoring, to set up anti-corruption measures in the area of illegal logging. Another one is the Ghana Investment Center, which where the technical assistance was to develop sustainable investment standards together with the investor community. And Ghana then created the category of recognized sustainable investments or investors, and they get certain privileges if it comes to approval procedures. So the TA was to help defining the RBC standards. So these were some examples to the raison to see, to give you some flavor of reform programs and technical assistance in the areas, in the 4 policy areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. So as we can see, these are very sound principles, but also very, very concrete potential reform and technical assistance opportunities. And we'll delve a little bit more into that in the coming interventions. I would now like to ask Ivan to the floor to give us a little bit the perspective, the global perspective from the World Bank Group. Over to you, Ivan. We cannot hear you, Ivan.
Good. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Let me start by just going through just a few trends that we've been seeing in the bank, the investment climate team, in terms of investment and FDI in particular. And that is that last year when we looked at FDI and FDI flows in greenfield flows, some 75% or thereabouts of new FDI was in green sectors. So it was actually very striking to see how much of the investment that is happening is supporting the green transition. And as Sylvia mentioned in the beginning, the gap between what's necessary to implement, the investment gap between what's necessary to implement the SDGs, the green transition being part of that, is growing, and it's 4 trillion right now. So in an environment where governments, in particularly developing country governments, are fiscally constrained, this investment that's much needed for the SDGs, for the green transition, for creating jobs, has to come from somewhere, and it's going to have to come from private investment, from the private sector. And that's why this agreement is particularly heartening that it comes at this time. And the other thing to point out is that, as Claudia said, it's one that's primarily driven by developing country governments. Developing country governments have been the ones at the forefront driving for this first global agreement on investment. And for those of us that have been around for a while, we know that there have been previous attempts to have such a global agreement on investment that have failed for various reasons, including the fact that perhaps those earlier attempts were driven by developed rather than developing countries. So this one sits on fairly firm, I would suggest, foundations. The other thing that I just wanted to quickly mention is, while we're seeing these positive development from developing countries in terms of supporting the IFD and being more prepared for transparent and open regimes for investment, on the other side of the coin, as a consequence of the geostrategic changes that we're seeing also increasing barriers to investment, but in developed countries. So more screening, more barriers, more broadening the definition of what is national security to increase the sectors that are under scrutiny when investment seeks to enter particular jurisdictions. And we're seeing more of that actually in developed countries. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot more recourse to incentives, particularly to support the green transition in developed countries, which could have consequences for developing countries in the sense that it will distort markets and it will make it more difficult for firms in developing countries to join global value chains as a consequence of these incentives that are very much looking to try to crowd in private investment into developed countries. So there are these trends that are somewhat contradictory and that are impacting on the global investment space, and therefore in that context, this agreement is particularly welcome. And I think, as has been said, while it does primarily focus on transparency, efficiency, and effectiveness of investment procedures, importantly, it does also go into areas that are, let's say, a little bit more difficult or more complex, such as incentives, institutional arrangements, responsible business conduct, as has been said, and linkages. Now, I think from the point of view of international organizations that work in this space of investment policy, investment climate, what we see is the opportunity to leverage this agreement in countries that not only want to accede to the agreement and apply its disciplines, but also that want to use it to actually go beyond the provisions of the agreement and reform in adjacent areas, such as market access, areas such as investment protection and so forth. So it really opens the door for a discussion or a dialogue with countries that are interested in leveraging this agreement for meeting the basic conditions of it, but also going beyond it. And therefore, it's organizations like our own, the World Bank, but also OECD and others as international organizations that work in the investment climate, investment policy space, that are available to support developing countries developing and least developed countries in a number of areas that are embedded in this agreement. And let me just mention sort of three. One is in the conduct of the country needs assessments. So when countries, and you'll hear more about this from Christian shortly, but in the needs assessment process, when countries determine how much and to what extent they're able to comply with the agreement right away, or if not, they need support to do so in some time in the future. This needs assessment, although it can be done by countries on their own, I would suggest that countries could use the support of organizations that have experience and understand what are best practices in each of these disciplines. And these disciplines have already been discussed by Mark and by Claudia, the specific provisions of the agreement. So that's one area of support. There is a document called a needs assessment questionnaire, which has been prepared through the WTO, through the Secretariat and Claudia's team, with the support of international organizations like the Bank and OECD, which is a guide for countries when wishing to enter into the agreement, so that they can actually understand where they are placed right now in terms of their compliance with it. And so that's one area, immediate area, where we're actually already doing we're preparing to do some pilots with countries that are interested to do self-assessments. The second area of support is, once that self-assessment has been done, it's in developing a reform program that will support the countries in the areas of need that it may have. So, let's say there are 10 provisions where they fall short. It's really about developing a program of action in terms of each of those areas. What's the technical assistance needed over what period of time that could be lent in order for the countries to be able to reach that bar. And finally, there's capacity building that could be done at any point in that process, that could also be offered by international organizations. So that were the main points that I wanted to sort of say as kind of general points. But let me just also reinforce, I think Mark very helpfully went through some, let's say, project examples. And what I want to do is just sort of instead of going through project examples, just some broad areas that this agreement opens up for deeper reforms, so that you just get a sense of how the agreement can be leveraged for a whole range of activities that would fall within the sort of framework of investment climate reforms. So in the area of, and I'll use the investment life cycle as a guide for this. So in the area of investment attraction, which if you consider sort of the life cycle is the early stages of the life cycle when countries are looking to attract investment. The sort of areas that are covered in the agreement include the establishment. In the agreement, they're called focal points, but in actual fact, these could well be investment promotion agencies or agencies within government with the responsibility for investment attraction. So it covers areas like the establishment of an IPA, the structure of an IPA, service provision of an IPA, but also within attraction, it also covers incentives. So, for example, the creation of comprehensive incentives inventories. Each of these three areas, just in the area of attraction, which could be sort of areas in which could be developed into sort of technical assistance. Then going further around the life cycle, you have entry and establishment. And here you've heard quite a bit about this, but work on streamlining business entry and establishment procedures. For example, company tax registration, registering property, etc. There's a whole plethora of procedures that we could be talking about here. Streamlining FDI-specific procedures, FDI approvals or registrations, or authentication or notarization of foreign documents, etc., etc. Licensing and permitting systems, expatriate work permits and visa regimes, so improvements to those. There could also be work in this area related to one-stop shops or single information portals, or both together, as is becoming quite the norm these days. And of course, how to use information and communication technologies in these areas related to establishment and entry processes. Going further around the life cycle, you have operation and expansion of businesses. And here again, there's several provisions in the agreement which can be used as an anchor for deeper reforms. So increasing investment, measure transparency and effectiveness. So including publication of measures, of course, advanced publication, opportunity for comments, impact assessments, and so forth. Establishment of focal points, but also establishment of grievance mechanisms, which is, there is a hook for that also within the agreement, which provides an entry point for all sorts of investor protection and retention activities and grievance mechanisms that would lead to the diagnosing of grievances before they can become investment disputes and go out and become much more complex issues. And then, of course, could be work on profit and payment repatriation. Also on, Anna will speak to this in a moment, but on responsible business conduct, and of course on consultation with private sector and public-private dialogue. And then ultimately around the life cycle linkages and internationalization of firms. And there we have, the possibility of work on online supplier databases, amongst other things. So hopefully you can see from that, quite extensive list that the agreement, although on the surface appearing to be, simply about transparency, not that that's simple, but it seems to be basic principles. But when you look at it more closely, it actually has embedded within it either much more deeper principles that can be, even at the surface level, but once you dig more deeply, can really be the foundation rock for a very deep program of investment climate reform. So from that point of view, I think it's interesting to international organizations like the World Bank, like the OECD, because this is the sweet spot where we operate. But it's also interesting, I would think, more so to developing and least developed countries with reformist governments who really want to be able to leverage this first international investment agreement for much more deeper reforms that will enable them, those governments and those countries, to be better placed in terms of attracting and growing private investment to meet the challenges that every country faces today. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Sylvia.
Thank you, Ivan, for giving us a little bit the global context, as well as breaking down a little bit throughout the phases of implementation, how the international community can support developing countries. And also it's encouraging to see the potential not only of using the agreement as almost a benchmark of global good practices, but even going beyond as an entry point for broad investment in climate reforms. A number, and including Claudia already mentioned, there's this special provision, which was the fundamental bar underneath the agreement for special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries. So now I would like to invite Christian to the floor to explain to us a little bit in further detail what does that mean and what are the implications. Over to you, Christian. I think we have some slides as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Sylvia, and good morning, good afternoon to our participants. So this agreement on investment facilitation for development includes a section on special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries, and that is, of course, absolutely in line with the objective of that agreement, namely to foster the development of developing and least developed countries. As Claudia already mentioned, the rules on special and differential treatment of the IFD agreement are modeled on the basis of the trade facilitation agreement. In that sense, there is already an existing example for these rules in the WTO rulebook, so they are not entirely new. What one can say as a general remark, I think, is that these rules provide a great deal of flexibility for developing and least developed countries in implementing this new agreement once it will enter into force. And that is, of course, important, considering that this agreement lays down rules that touch upon the domestic regulatory frameworks of developing and least developed countries when it comes to investment. And these countries will have to adjust those frameworks in light of the rules that are included in this agreement. Next slide, please. I think what is important to understand is that implementation capacity is the notion that really guides the rules on special and differential treatment. To the extent that a developing or a least developed country does not have implementation capacity, and that is capacity to implement a provision, a commitment under the IFD agreement, that country will not be required to implement that provision until it has acquired the implementation capacity. So implementation capacity, the notion of implementation capacity really is the overarching or guiding principle for the rules on special and differential treatment. It is this implementation capacity, the existence or non-existence of that capacity, that will determine the extent and the timing of implementation by developing countries and least developed countries. Now, to the extent that a developing country or a least developed country does not have the requisite implementation capacity and needs technical or financial assistance as well as capacity building measures to acquire that implementation capacity, the provision of such assistance and capacity building measures is foreseen in the agreement as a sine qua non for a country to actually being able to implement a given provision. So implementation capacity, if the acquisition of that capacity needs the provision of such assistance and capacity building measures, then that assistance and these capacity building measures will have to be provided for a given developing country or least developed countries to acquire the necessary capacity. Of course, the provision of technical or financial assistance and capacity building measures will depend on mutually agreed terms between donors and the developing country or least developed country in question. Now, the agreement sets forth a number of principles for providing technical assistance and capacity building measures. I won't go through these principles. I think the overall principle here is that such technical assistance and capacity building measures should not compromise the existing development priorities of a developing country or least developed country. Another important principle for the rules on special and differential treatment besides implementation capacity is the principle of self-designation. So it is up to each developing country and least developed country to self-designate the provisions of the IFDA agreement that it wishes to implement, and we will see in a second how that self-designation is supposed to work. But in order to be able to actually self-designate commitments under the agreement for implementation, developing countries and least developed countries will have to go through a process of self-assessment in order to determine what is the status of their implementation capacity with respect to the provisions of that agreement. And here, as we have already heard by both Claudia and Ivan, a self-assessment guide exists. That guide has been developed by the WTO in cooperation with other international organizations and is designed to help developing countries and least developed countries to actually undertake such a self-assessment. Now, we know that more than 30 developing countries and least developed countries have indicated in the WTO a need for support in conducting those self-assessments. And we heard from Claudia a minute ago that this process of self or needs assessments will now be accelerated. And we heard from Ivan that international organizations are ready to provide support to developing countries and least developed countries in conducting this very important, very first step, so that the countries in question know where they still have needs for technical assistance and capacity building measures in order to acquire implementation capacity. Next slide, please. Now, talking about this principle of self-designation, the section of the IFD agreement on special and differential treatment provides for 3 different categories, A, B, and C. And these 3 categories are a reflection of different levels of implementation capacity or not existing implementation capacity of developing countries and least developed countries. And these countries are free to designate the commitments of that IFD agreement under these 3 categories, depending on their status of implementation capacity and their implementation needs. Now, so to speak, the easiest category is category A. In this category, developing countries and least developed countries will designate those commitments where they are confident that they have the requisite capacity to implement these commitments. And once a country has designated a commitment in category A, that commitment will have to be implemented upon entry into force of the IFD agreement. LDCs have 1 year after the entry into force of that agreement. The next category, category B, is slightly more difficult in the sense that that category concerns commitments where developing countries and least developed countries do not yet have the requisite capacity to implement the commitments that they designate in this category, but they are confident that after a transitional period of time that they can determine themselves that they would be able to implement the commitments in that particular category. And the most difficult category is category C, most difficult in the sense that this category concerns commitments where developing countries and least developed countries know that they do not have implementation capacity, but they also know that that a transitional period of time in and of itself will not be sufficient to actually acquire the requisite capacity to implement those commitments, but rather they will need, in addition to such a transitional period of time, technical assistance and capacity building measures in order to acquire the capacity to implement commitments that they designate for this particular category. Next slide, please. Now, so far we have addressed, let's say, the broad lines of the rules on special and differential treatment. Let's go into some detail. Now, as I already mentioned, when it comes to commitments designated for category A, they will have to be implemented upon entry into force, or for LDCs 1 year after entry into force. But there is an, so to say, additional safety net for developing countries and least developed countries, because the rules on special and differential treatment also provide for a grace period for the application of the dispute settlement understanding of the WTO after entry into force of the IFD agreement. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that grace period is 2 years after entering into force for developing countries and 6 years for least developed countries after entering into force of the IFD agreement. Now, an open question for me in this respect is, does this period of 6 years, does it take into account the fact that LDCs have to implement category A commitments only 1 year after entering into force, or will that year be added? That might be a question for Claudia to answer. Now, with respect to categories B and C, the picture is of course different compared to category A commitments. Here, developing countries and least developed countries will have to notify the dates for implementation of the commitments that they have designated for these two categories. And there are 2 dates for implementation. There is an indicative date for implementation that will have to be notified, and then later on, there is a definitive date for implementation that will have to be notified to the committee that will be established under the IFD agreement. There are certain timelines that apply for the notification of those dates, and these timelines are different for developing countries and for least developed countries. Now, there is the possibility under the rules to actually extend implementation dates that have been notified to the committee. So if developing countries or least developed countries become aware that they face difficulties in actually meeting these implementation dates, they can notify to the committee that they actually require more time for implementing the commitments concerned. And if the additional time required does not exceed 18 months in the case of developing countries or 3 years in the case of least developed countries, no decision by the committee on the extension is required. So the extension is automatically granted. If, however, developing countries and least developed countries would need more time, then a decision by the committee would be needed. Finally, there even is the possibility for developing countries and for least developed countries to shift between category B and C. That is to say that commitments that a developing country or least developed country has designated for category B can actually be shifted to category C. And that would mean that if they shift a commitment or several commitments from category B to C, that they thereby signal that a transitional period of time is not sufficient for implementation of the commitment concerned, but they would actually also require technical assistance and capacity building measures. As a last point, here again, with respect to these two categories, there is a grace period for the application of the dispute settlement understanding of the WTO, which applies to implementation of commitments under these two categories by least developed countries. And if I'm not mistaken, that grace period is 8 years. And this period will run once implementation of these commitments has started. So that was the overview on the rules on special and differential treatment for developing countries and least developed countries. Back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Christian. I felt it was for me was a deep dive into the different exactly the differential treatment for developing and least developed countries. Now looking forward, a lot of discussion in the international community is really about sustainable investment, environmental, social standards. What is the contribution of investment to that? So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you, Anna, more about that from the perspective of OECD. Over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sylvia, and thanks to you and the World Bank for inviting the OECD to this very timely webinar. I will come back to the big picture because I think that we are having deep in and I will go to this sustainable issue. But I just want to mention, as Claudia started this presentation, that it's a very timely. I'm very happy that you organized this webinar, because even though the plurilateral nature of the WTO agreement has not been approved yet, as Claudia mentioned, the text is finalized and it's a positive development, and it's good to mention that. And as many of the previous speakers have mentioned already, this agreement is to improve the investment and business climate, to attract more investment and strengthen the positive impact in societies. I will focus my intervention on the sustainable development part of the agreements. But before presenting, I would like to underscore an important aspect, and the important aspect is that countries are not starting their reform efforts from scratch. In fact, as was mentioned by Ivan, the OECD, the World Bank, the UNCTAD have a long-standing experience in assisting developing countries in designing and implementing investment climate reform to support sustainable development. And I would say many of our support has been aligned with this measure covered by the WTO agreement. And that means that participants and non-participants of this negotiation have done a lot of effort in the last year or decade to improve their investment climate. And I'm confident that these countries will kind of recognize this progress when they start to go to this agreement. And also the thing that additional effort that they need to do will be, frankly, for their own benefit, I hope so. Let me now move to this related to sustainable investment. And I would also like to start with the basic, the core investment facilitation provisions that we have been that have been presented right now by Mark, by Claudia, are to increase foreign direct investment flows into a given economy. The core of these investment facilitations is quantity, but the quantity is the prerequisite to the sustainability, because if you don't have FDI, then you cannot make the best of this FDI. That means that you require facilitation measures and notably promoting transparency, as has been mentioned, providing this degree of predictability, simplifying investment-related process. That means that investment facilitations allows host economy to create favorable conditions for business to operate, but to increase the quality, the impact of this, you need to enhance another kind of policies. And I think that this is something that we have been working at the OECD with the FDA Quality Initiative, that in a way, how are the complementary aspects that you need to increase and strengthen the positive impact of FDI and investment facilitation measures. And the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement at the WTO also consider this kind of aspect. And the two that are included there, but there are others that I want to mention because it's part also of how to strengthen the impact of the FDI in the sustainability impact. But the two that have been mentioned are responsible business conduct and anti-corruption. And I will want to start with the responsible business conduct, because this what they do is that encourage investors to voluntarily adapt international recognized principles, standards, and guidelines, such as the OECD, the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, and the ILO M&E Declaration. And also what they do is that encourage business investors to undertake meaningful engagement and dialogue with indigenous people and local communities. And the third element that is very important is the idea to implement due diligence in order to address the adverse impact. That this is something that is more and more present in the requirement of many legislation. And of course, as was mentioned before, I think that this is important that this kind of commitment will increase the positive impact of these flows that are coming, or the flows that are attracted by the investment facilitation. It's important to mention of the international standards, because it has been a decades of building on this standard. I mean that the recognition of these three main standards are kind of to facilitate what is the expectation that business will have. And then I think that at the OECD, we have been working a lot on the RBC, developing the due diligence, what are the expectations of the due diligence. And I think that we will be happy to contribute on that. On anti-corruption, I think that is also something similar. In addition to prevent and fight corruption, this measure requires members also to prevent and fight money laundering and terrorist financing. And on this area also are many international agreements that are set some minimum standards. And here I want to also have in mind that these two aspects, that RBC and anti-corruption, as I mentioned before in the investment facilitation provision, the same applies here. Countries are not starting from the scratch. And for example, many countries have developed a national action plan for human rights and business that are kind of related, or the same issue with the ILO and the OECD. That means that it's building a little more. It's kind of helping. Is going a little beyond this effort, but there are some effort. There are some movement. We are not starting from the scratch. Maybe I want to just to finish, because I want to have some time maybe for some kind of question. I would like to also emphasize that the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement include other aspects that maybe are not under the section of sustainable investment, but according to our approach of investment policy reform, are key to strengthen the sustainable impact of investment. And this is linkage with domestic suppliers, the M&E and SME linkage, and regulatory coherence are aspects that will help to increase the sustainable impact, even if they are not in part of the sustainable section. And this is important because I think that what exactly, for example, when you attract investment and you have multinationals in your country, you want that they linked with the SMEs. And this, of course, create not only quality job, create innovation, could create innovation. That means that are important provisions that are including. And finally, and as mentioned in the report prepared by this webinar, donor can also support government, providing coherent strategy, direction, information, capacity building, and fostering investment in support of sustainable development, assessing and monitoring the impact of FDI, and strengthening related policies. Because as Ivan mentioned, these provisions, including the investment facilitation for development agreement, are also an entry point to do kind of broader reforms. Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this very concise commentary. If you don't mind muting, I think there's a bit of an echo from my side. I would like to now open the floor for questions. I see no questions on the Q&A, but I did receive a question by email on the side. And I think this is mainly a question directed at Claudia, Anna, and Ivan. So when looking at the list of signatory countries on Claudia's slides, we see a group of countries from different development levels and capacity to pass and implement reforms. And as you mentioned, Anna, in most countries, we're not starting from scratch. Countries have been doing this. For the ones that maybe have more a broader reform agenda ahead of them, do you have any suggestions on how governments should go about prioritizing some of these reforms? So I don't know who would like to start. Claudia, please.
I can just say actually that from the WTO's point of view, in a sense, or from the the countries negotiating this agreement, there is a sense indeed by some that for them the key articles, so to speak, or the things to start with are transparency and streamlining of investment authorization procedures. Certainly from the point of view of the developed countries, donors countries, they would probably want developing countries to start with what they consider those key provisions, maybe. But as such, in the developing countries are of course free to determine, totally free to determine, what sequencing they would like to do, and if they deem that some measures they want to prioritize some measures over others, they are free to do so. Even though, as Christian explained, the technical assistance will be provided on a mutually agreed terms between the donor countries eventually and the recipient countries. So, but there is nothing in the agreement, let's say, that determines a certain, sequencing or says that some sectors are more important than others. Donor countries may indeed eventually in negotiating with the recipient countries then consider that some parts are more important, or let's say more should be done before others. So generally speaking, I would say that the transparency and the streamlining of investment procedures and all the related good governance provisions, like appeal and review, independence of competent authorities, such things are seen as priorities from, let's say, the developed countries' point of view. But again, there's no obligation. Thanks.
Okay, Sylvia, very, very brief. I would say that exactly this is the beauty of the agreement, that in a way the government have the flexibility, the country have the flexibility, and it will be different, the challenges, even inside the transparency and the streamlined sections for different countries. But I would say that it's very, very important, and this is our experience working with developing countries, is that to match the donors and the developing countries like a desire, because when countries wants to reform, then the reforms are easy to implement. That means that there is a work, but I think that the flexibility that provide the agreement, I think that allows to countries and donors go and then see what are the priorities, and will change probably country by country.
And the self-assessment guide that was mentioned, I think, is also a very great tool available to countries to exactly assess what are the gaps and what could be potential priorities. Ivan, I will take the liberty to combine this question with another one that we have in the chat very quickly. We will run a few minutes over, but I promise not more than 5 minutes. Does the World Bank already have an idea, and maybe also this is maybe other panelists want to come in as well, in terms of how many countries might ask or need technical assistance, and how will those countries be prioritized? And the magic question, what would be the potential level of effort required in terms of budgeting and resources, and any experience that may be able to or can be shared from the trade facilitation agreement implementation work? Over to you, Ivan.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the question. I think it was Brigitte. Yeah, so in terms of how many countries would be requesting support, I think the WTO has actually conducted a survey, and I think Christian made reference to some 30 countries that had expressed such an interest or thereabouts.
33 actually at the moment, yeah.
Thanks. Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, so that's kind of an initial indication, but I think that's probably a severe underestimation at this point, because it's a survey conducted amongst you know, at a particular point in time. I think what we know also is that there's a little bit of work to be done in terms of advocacy in relation to the agreement. I think a lot of countries in the parts of the bureaucracy that need to know about this agreement don't yet know about the agreement, because it's been negotiated in Geneva with you know, colleagues who are based there, who are, you know, primarily trade experts, and then, you know, the counterparts in capital that would be most relevant for the agreement are, you know, in the investment field, maybe in the IPA or in ministries and so forth. Anyway, there's various reasons why there's that 30, although seems quite a good number, is probably not an accurate reflection of how many countries might be looking to seek support. And we also know, because in some of the countries where, as the bank, we're already working on investment climate programs, when we inform our counterparts about the agreement, they become very interested in, you know, in sort of knowing more about it and in what a self-assessment would entail. And so it seems to me that there's going to be quite a bit of latent demand there. Exactly how many countries, I don't know. How we would prioritize that, I guess, we haven't given that a lot of thought. We would have to, it would depend to some extent, I guess, on the partnership support that we get from outside institutions who would want to sort of partner with us in there, if there are priority countries for them. For us, any developing country or LDC is a priority. So, you know, we would have to sort of think about that with partners about which would be a priority. In terms of level of effort, it's also difficult to say, but there have been some pilots done, not by us, but by other institutions. My sense is that what it would require, certainly to carry out the self-assessment, because there's a broad range of stakeholders, we would look at it as needing an initial, let's say, initial consultation with, you know, 2 to 3 sort of experts in the field going to the country, discussing and ensuring that the questionnaire is distributed amongst all of the relevant stakeholders. So first of all, identifying the stakeholders is actually going to be quite a task in each country, because each country is quite different in how it deals with investment climate and investment policy issues, and who are the relevant agencies. But once that's done, so that would be kind of one visit for one period of time, discussing with multiple stakeholders that might take about a week. Then there would be a period of time in which those stakeholders would be you know, going through the questionnaire, and in parallel at the same time, what we would be doing as the support people for the self-assessment would be doing a de facto and de jure sort of analysis of our own in terms of the country's performance under each of the disciplines. So we would try to then, once going back, to validate whatever findings, you know, we have of our own vis-a-vis whatever comes back from the questionnaires. So there would be some kind of validation process and workshop. We know that in the case of the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, this workshop, when they did a similar kind of workshop, was about a week-long event with the various stakeholders there. And what we also know from that process was that it was quite important to have, let's say, a neutral party like an international organization in the room to sort of not so much arbitrate, but to facilitate a common agreement around the answer to each of these questions, because different parts of government may have different views about how whether they fully or not fully comply with the discipline, or how long they might need to comply with it, as Christian was pointing out earlier. So we think that given the, I think relatively fair to say, higher complexity of the investment topic, it might take a bit more than a week, so but thereabouts. And then there would be a period after that workshop of assuming that at the end of the workshop there is a complete set of answers to all of the questions, a period of kind of going away and making sure that everything is in order, that everyone agrees, that there is a consensus, and then that the self-assessment would be complete at that point. So I hasten to put some kind of a dollar figure on that, but in terms of level of effort, I think that's the level of effort. I think 2 or 3 experts, someone who's also expert that's supporting the process in country, working with the government, and then two visits to the country, one to establish the process, the second one to conduct the self-assessment workshop, and then some work afterwards. So, that's kind of the level of effort that we're looking at. That said, we're about to embark upon some pilot self-assessments, and we'll probably know a lot better in the next couple of months what that looks like. I hope that provides some guidance. I know there are a lot of open questions that I've left, but that's because we're not entirely, since we have not done a pilot yet, we're not entirely clear on how long it would take, but this is our envisaged timeline at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivan. I do want to give a little bit of space just for the last question from Christian. Over to you, Anna, and I can take the part on Be Ready on behalf of the board.
Thanks for the question, Christian. I think that I would like to clarify the different indicators that exist in the market. First, it doesn't exist for the moment indicator for the investment facilitation for development agreement. Okay, that means that in a way, for the trade facilitation, the OECD has kind of an indicator of trade facilitation implementation that put the disciplines and then how the countries are around this kind of discipline. But this doesn't exist right now on this investment facilitation for development agreement. I mean, maybe in the future will, but not right now. What we have in the IFDA, there are different kind of indicators. I think that there are some indicators that are measuring the business kind of environment, and I think that this is probably the new Be Ready double World Bank will do something like this, and maybe some of these measures will be related with the investment facilitation for development agreement. We have the FDI restrictiveness index that measure the discriminatory measures that countries have, and then how they are increasing or decreasing barriers in the time. And then the FDI quality indicators measure something different. That is, what is the impact of the FDI on skills, on green, on women empowerment. It's kind of different indicators that measure different things. At the end, all complement each other. And I think that maybe in the future, when we have more clarity about this agreement, we can work together with the WTO, with World Bank, and then create some kind of indicator for investment facilitation for development agreement. But for the moment, it doesn't exist. And in general, I would say that the indicators that exist on FDI are pretty complementary in the market right now.
Thank you, Anna. No, it's an interesting thought on how to develop a results framework essentially for the implementation of the agreement. Just to say, in the upcoming Be Ready methodology, the principles of transparency, efficiency, effectiveness. So a lot of the principles that are underlying the agreement are very much part of the Be Ready methodology, even if it's not a direct corresponding indicator measuring quote unquote implementation, but those are very much aligned. We are over time. I do apologize. That is on me as a moderator. I didn't want to interrupt any of these very interesting interventions. For me, it was really a seminar more than a webinar. So I want to thank very, very much all the speakers. Excuse me. Just maybe 3 takeaways from my side. Number one, the agreements and the developments around me couldn't be more timely in the current panorama and landscape of investment. Yes, a lot of investment climate reforms have been going on, but the need is even more pressing now. We've heard about the the investment gap, particularly in developing countries, around new challenges of climate change, sustainable investment. So it's very timely. It is in the right direction. It is driven by developing countries. I think that's a very, very important point. Over 100 developing countries have been participating in the negotiations. So it is a consensus-driven agreement on some very, very sound principles for sustainable investment, anchored on transparency, efficiency, and effectiveness. We've heard some very practical examples of the type of reforms that countries have been doing. And Ivan also, not only Ivan, others also spoke a little bit more about what are the tools available to countries in terms of the self-assessment guide, as well as hopefully support. Something also that struck me is in the agreement, it foresees explicitly technical assistance and support by the international community. So I think this is a call for action for all of us around the table. And foresees a differentiated approach, which makes a lot of sense depending on where the countries are in their development. So with that, I would like to thank you once again. The webinar was recorded, and also the note that Mark was mentioning will be available on the DCED, the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development's website, and the link will be shared with all participants. So thank you again. It was a real pleasure, and I wish you a very great rest of the day or beginning of the day, wherever you find yourself on the globe. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sylvia. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Sylvia.
Thanks. Nice to see all of you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.